In this video, we'll be incorporating Keyri QR login into a system that uses Auth0 for user authentication and user management. Part 1 will cover creating this web app that you see here using Next.js. Part 2 will cover incorporating the Keyri SDK into a Flutter mobile app. And by the end of this series, you'll be able to use that Flutter mobile app to scan this QR code and log in into this web app using a already signed in state in the mobile app. Now we'll basically be starting with just the Next.js starter web page and creating the content component you see here that changes based on whether someone is logged in or not. So let's get started. We'll start off with some boilerplate React stuff. Let's create the content component. This is an extremely simple web app in which authentication is simply dictated by React states. And so it's not exactly persistent, but persistence isn't really the goal of this guide. It's more to demonstrate how Keyri and Auth0 interact. And so for persistence, you can take any strategy that you'd like. Now we'll set up the handle QR login function, which basically just takes the refresh token that comes in from your mobile app and exchanges it with the Auth0 API for an access token and an ID token. Now, this function, I believe, really ought to be handled server side because as you'll see, as part of this function and specifically the part in which we interact with the Auth0 API, we are utilizing the client ID and client secret for your Auth0 application, and that, of course, is best left to server-side functions. Obviously, you do not want to expose that on your front end. Now here we're doing the fetch component of this function, and here you just have to hit your token endpoint for your Auth0 domain. This is what we're using for this demonstration. Now here I'm going to paste in the client ID and client secret for our demo application. Um, Obviously here you would have to use yours, and again, I highly recommend utilizing this function, or at least this fetch component on your server. Now, when you make this post to the Auth0 API, you will get back an ID token and an access token. And those are the two things that you'll use on your front end to maintain a logged in session. And so as part of this data, the ID token will take the form of a JWT, and we basically just need to decode that JWT to, for this very simple web application, retrieve the user's user ID, just for the sake of showing it on the web page to demonstrate that the user is in fact logged in. And so with this line, we are taking the base64 encoded string following the first period in the JWT and preceding the second period. Now, of course, A to B is deprecated, but again, for the sake of minimizing the lines of code in this very simple web application, that's what we're sticking with. And now we have a decoded JWT, we have the user's user ID, as well as a separate access token. And so basically what you can do is you can take those two tokens and you can save them to local storage, for example. And so like that, you can store them in local storage and deal with them later. But what we're going to do, again, for the sake of this very simple application, is we're just going to set the states for the authenticated session. And so if someone refreshes the authentication status, the session will disappear. But again, that's not the focus of this application. And that's the entirety of our handle QR login function. Now we have to set up our use effect. The critical part of this use effect is creating our event listener that listens for emissions from the Keyri widget, which is an iframe, and we'll get to that in a moment. But let's just set up the event listener now to listen for events coming out of the iframe, and based on that, trigger the handle QR login function. Now, just to walk you through what we're actually doing here, again, we're setting up the event listener. Here we're screening for what event exactly we want to listen for. Here, of course, we want to listen for events coming out of the Keyri widget. And so out of the event, is it of the type Keyri? All events emitted by the Keyri widget will have the type of Keyri. Is there actually data in this event data? If so, then proceed. And finally, is the origin of this event actually the web page that's running the Keyri widget? And that's just to filter out events emitted by, for example, your browser extensions, or rather your users' browsers and browser extensions. And so if indeed it is a valid event coming out of the Keyri widget, then set that to data. And then within data, the Keyri widget could return an error. And so if there's no error, then proceed with establishing the refresh token that we ultimately pass into handle QR login as the refresh token within the Keyri payload. The Keyri payload being data.data, as in the data within the events data object. And that comes through as a stringified JSON. And so we first parse it and then select the refresh token and pass that into the handle QR login function. And that's it for the, I guess, the hard part. Now let's just set up our JSX. Now again, we're using the Next.js starter template, and so we'll be piggybacking off of the styling and class names um, that that already uses. And so right now what we're doing is we're setting up the view for the unauthenticated state, and that's basically this. Some text, and then an instruction for how to log in, and then the Keyri QR widget itself. And the widget is actually installed as an iframe served to this component from the same domain on which the remainder of the site is hosted, as in the origin from which this content component is served. And so here it is. Here's KeyriQR.html that we're sticking into the public directory, and later we'll be referencing within this content component. All of the source code, or rather just the HTML for this file, can be found on the Keyri docs site. So let's go here, come down to the browser page, and here's the link. So basically just copy and paste that into a file called KeyriQR.html. Now that that's there, let's just serve it up as iframe. And now the iframe is properly embedded into the unauthenticated state of the content component. Now here, of course, we have quite a few attributes. What's actually absolutely required is the source and setting scrolling to no. These other attributes, border, height, width, and styling attributes, are all entirely optional. With that, let's move on to the authenticated state. Now let's export this component, save, and now we are including that in our app index, and that's being rendered here. That's it for the actual integration of Keyri into a site, and this is ready to be deployed to the web, and it'll work as long as you have already registered your domain that you're deploying it to on the Keyri dashboard. That's app.keyri.com. In case you simply want to test it on localhost here, what you can do is, per the documentation, specify your origin, as in, let's say, the domain on which you will ultimately be deploying, and the domain that you have used to register on app.keyri.com is your.registered.domain.com. Just specify as query params that the environment is dev and your origin is the origin that you'll ultimately deploy to. And with that, the widget will behave as if the widget in your uh, in your locally hosted app on localhost will behave as if it's on your .registered.domain.com. And please note that that only works, that query param workaround only works on localhost. It will not work on the web, and so you'll have to remove that um, when deploying. So the source will have to look like this. And that's it. Thanks for watching. Like I said, in part two, we'll be covering how to incorporate uh, the mobile side of Keyri into a Flutter app that works with this web page. Thanks for watching.